Okay, let me just start presenting. And that's it. Welcome everybody to this session of the Climate Week NYC. So this is a session from Viridios AI on AI technology and value discovery on the carbon markets. So I'd like to start here with our agenda. Just one moment. Yeah, I'd like to start with our agenda with the topics that we're going to cover. So I'm afraid that we're going to have to start initially. Let me just admit someone here. Yeah, we're going to have to start two topics to cover the carbon markets and the climate challenge that the carbon markets actually tries to solve before we can even talk about AI. It's a very complex and a very timely type of topic, as most of you on the call have been following, through the media and obviously through our corporate lives so far. So I'd like to start with the discussion of the climate challenge that we're all embedded in, and then we move into a brief overview of the voluntary carbon market, which is the focus of our technology or the technology that has been developed in order to provide value discovery. So right after that, then we start really discussing more on the AI technology and how this can actually help providing value discovery in this market. And after that, we can go into a Q&A session. I'll try to reserve at least 20 minutes for Q&A again, so that we can have a proper discussion if there are questions or anything else anybody would like to comment. So just to start the session, let's have a brief discussion on the climate challenge. And I'd like to start with this video, which is about a couple of minutes.
In 2015, world leaders met in Paris and agreed on a most ambitious goal to tackle climate change, limiting the global temperature rise by 1.5 degrees Celsius compared to pre-industrial era levels. To meet this goal, we need to have the amount of greenhouse gas emissions released into the atmosphere by 2030 and drive them down to net zero by 2050. Something of this magnitude requires radical changes. There is already a strong push for governments, businesses, and individuals to do the right thing by their environmental, social, and economic footprints. However, it will take time. In the meantime, offsetting emissions today through the carbon markets offers a viable path in the transition to a net zero emissions world. Carbon credits, or offsets as they are also known, are generated by activities that avoid, reduce, or remove greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. For example, activities such as no-tillage in regenerative farming and conservation of forests generate carbon credits through emissions removal and avoidance. These carbon credits are then acquired by individuals and corporations, for which reduction of emissions through their activities is neither economically viable nor immediately available. And given the co-benefits embedded in specific carbon projects, buyers of carbon credits not only offset emissions, but also create significant environmental, social, and economic impact in helping developing countries meet the United Nations 17 Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs. Recent reports indicate that in order to achieve the Paris Agreement goals, carbon markets need to grow substantially, up to 15 times by 2030. Our mission at Viridios Group is to contribute toward this growth trajectory and ultimately meeting the Paris Agreement goals through innovation in finance and technology. There is lots to do and little time to waste. Viridios is here to help meet the challenge.
Okay, here we have it. So just leveraging a little bit on the video as we heard. The current stage of the climate negotiations, or I would say the climate agreements that we have in the world, is the latest Paris Agreement, which was signed in 2015. So what I project in the screen here is basically a history of what has happened in terms of climate negotiations and how the world has evolved in terms of achieving those goals. So with the Paris Agreement, we are talking about reducing our current level of emissions globally by half in 10 years, or in less than 10 years, from 2021 all the way to 2030. And that's a very, very ambitious goal to meet. Now, even before that, when the whole thing started in Rio 1992 with Earth Summit, that was already, a challenge in the minds of world leaders and businesses, but very little, could be done at that point in time with the way businesses were carried in the world. So as the international negotiations progressed from 92, there was annual meetings, so as it is today. So every year, countries meet in a different, representatives of countries meet in a different country. In fact, this year it's going to be in Glasgow. And they go into those in specific negotiations for the climate mitigation. And in 1997, there was the so-called Kyoto Protocol signed. So the Kyoto Protocol was really a major evolution on that in that process since Rio, because now it actually created legally binding agreements among countries, especially developed countries, who are the biggest emitters at that point in time, to mitigate emissions. And the Kyoto Protocol came effectively into implementation during the period of 2008 to 2012. After 97, the signing, there were a lot of discussion on how to do it. So the signing of the protocol is basically on what to do. And then a lot of discussions go on. Fast forward to 2008, 2012, you have the implementation. And that started with international trading of carbon allowances among countries, as well as offsetting. And offsetting, the main offsetting mechanism at that point in time was the Clean Development Mechanism of the UN, CDM, which was basically about implementing carbon projects and reducing emissions through the implementation of those projects, which I'm going to cover a little bit more in detail in the presentation. However, the global financial crisis really derailed the Kyoto Protocol implementation at that point. So as most of you in the call will know, the global financial crisis really created a massive depression in the global economy. Initially in the United States, it spread around the world, and later on in Europe, it really affected Europe much harder in 2010 and 2011. As you can see, the whole period from 2008 and 2012 was a period of economic crisis. And in economic crisis, when corporations in industrial facilities and airlines, when everybody's suffering and actually, reducing production, right, as a consequence of that, reducing emissions, it becomes a very weak proposition in that sort of environment to actually push towards reduction of emissions and further forcing companies to increase costs by reducing emissions. And that was the cause for the Kyoto Protocol not being a great success in that period. A little bit fast forward, then we had the Paris Agreement, which was another major movement towards the climate mitigation. In the Paris Agreement now, not only developed countries committed to have a reduction in carbon emissions, but also developing countries. We have targets, predefined targets for reduction of emissions as well. We are now in that period, similar to what the Kyoto Protocol had in 97, between 97 and 2008, there was a period of negotiations and trying to figure out exactly how to implement it. So the Paris Agreement was signed in 2015. That was what to do, and we are in that process now of negotiation towards how to do it. And the how to do, we have basically two main components. One is, again, another international trading scheme among countries, and also a new global offset program, which is not clear what's going to be at this point. But all of this coming together in the context of this chart you see here. So we're basically here in 2020, roughly 2021, with a level of emissions which are currently at around 40 to 45 billion tons of carbon dioxide a year that's pumped into the atmosphere. With the Paris Agreement, we are supposed to reduce between 2018 and 2030 that amount by over 50%, as you can see in the chart. It's already challenging enough. And then further to that, the agreement prescribes net zero emission reduction. So basically, we're going to be net zero in the economy by 2050. And when I mean net zero, it's not that nobody's emitting anymore. Of course, we're still going to have airlines probably still using jet fuel at that point. Who knows what kind of other technology will emerge. We're still going to have a number of different emission activities in the economy. But there would be, the expectation at least, that there would be a number of removal activities, which is what you see as the green shaded area of the chart. And removal activities are like, reforestation of barren areas of the planet, trees that were cut down by humans, over millennia, for example, and forests in those areas disappeared. Or afforestation. Afforestation is actually growing forests where there was never a forest there before. So it's human-made forest, which is also a great way to capture carbon. Another type of technology that's emerging very fast today, or I would say methodology emerging very fast today, is related to agriculture practices. And there are a number of things that agriculture can contribute in terms of providing removals. So soil is actually a fantastic way to capture carbon. And one way, for example, is to practice agriculture without tillage. When you till the land, you actually end up releasing carbon into the atmosphere. And agriculture without tillage allows plants to capture carbon and store it through the root systems, for example. So the practice of biochar, cover crops, mulching, there are a number of different techniques that are starting to be used in agriculture that it's really becoming very promising towards coming up with the removals that are needed towards net zero emissions in 2050. Okay, so with that, let's talk a little bit about the voluntary carbon market and how the voluntary carbon market actually can contribute to that. I will start by saying that when we're talking about voluntary carbon market, it means that it's a market where corporations today are buying carbon credits on projects that are developed in many parts of the world on a supposedly voluntary basis, because there is no government forcing those companies to do that. However, I would say that calling it voluntary today is becoming more and more of a misnomer, because the ones who are actually holding corporations compliant with their carbon footprint are actually the shareholders and the stakeholders of those corporations. This is a phenomenon that is being observed more actively since the Paris Agreement in 2015. It was not there as intensive as it is today. In fact, if you talk to wealth management managers out there covering portfolios of millions of different wealth management clients, you will hear from them that it's almost impossible to sell a portfolio today without a good ESG score. Where it was 10 years ago, something like that was unheard. The primary objective was simply to achieve returns. So with that, let's take a look at this chart. And remember, on the previous chart, we were talking about a reduction of over 50% in emissions between 2018 and 2030. If those emissions are at around 40 to 45 billion tons, we're talking about over 20 billion tons of CO2 that needs to be reduced or captured between 2018 and 2030 in order for us to have any hope of achieving the Paris Agreement goals. Now, this chart actually shows a projection of how the voluntary carbon market can help in terms of its current trend of growth. And the current projection is that the voluntary carbon market could contribute with 1 billion tons of CO2 a year reduction between now and 2030. And compare that to 20, it's still quite small. There will be a number of other initiatives, and not only through carbon markets and carbon credits, but actual implementation of actual emission reduction activities through the emitters themselves. But a growth in a market, that's around 100 million to 1 billion. So that's a 10 times growth in this market, which is still quite small compared to what needs to be achieved. It's something absolutely amazing, absolutely incredible, what can happen in this market going forward. So this is just to give a sense and an idea of where we are and where a market like this can get to, and why it's important to talk about value discovery, because on a market, with a market growth of this magnitude, we need to talk about the value of the assets that are in this market and how we're going to be perceiving that value. So another point of support to that argument of the market growth in the voluntary carbon market, it's a number of things that have been happening quite recently. So if you look at the left side of the page now, so just through COVID, and you can imagine COVID was a major hit on the economy in terms of economic activity, the carbon market still managed to grow about 20%. And globally today, it's about $270 billion. And that's the total market, including compliance markets, not only the voluntary carbon market, but still 20% growth in a market through a period that was practically a depression period. It's incredible. More recently, you probably saw in the news, Biden is committing $2 trillion to this infrastructure plan, which addresses a number of points on climate change. And the Biden administration has committed to half its emissions of the United States for the next 10 years by 2030, which the United States is still the biggest emitter in the world today. And it's a major step towards support of that argument on the growth in the market. And we put it all together, and there is this report that came out from McKinsey that actually estimates a growth of 15 times between now, the level of the market now and 2030. So, and before, so we've been talking about a lot on the climate issue, with potential for the market, but it's quite important actually to now talk about what are these assets. And I wanted to give a brief introduction here of what we mean when we talk about carbon credit or carbon market. So a carbon credit is basically like any financial security in the market, like a bond, like an equity. It's an asset that can be traded. It's something that can be monetized. And by the way, apologies by the construction noise in the background. But so as you see on the top of the screen, a carbon credit comes from an avoidance or removal activity from a project. So, and I gave a couple of examples like reforestation, soil carbon, agricultural practice. Those are removal activities. And there are more heavily skewed avoidance activities, such as conserving forests, although forests also remove, but it's primarily an avoidance type of activity. If you conserve forests, obviously you avoid emissions, because post cutting down the trees, those trees are going to turn into emissions after that. Plus, those trees can no longer capture carbon from the atmosphere. You also have renewable energy projects, for example, that's more in the common vocabulary. Everybody knows solar energy, wind energy, and wind power, and so on these days. So once a project is implemented that demonstrates that it can avoid or capture or remove emissions, a carbon credit is generated out of that, like a digital security called carbon credit. So those digital securities are actually demanded and are bought by CO2 emitters, manufacturing, airlines, you name it. Every company in the world that has any economic activity is emitting carbon indirectly, directly or indirectly, and it has the potential to be buying those carbon credits. A number of these companies make pledges, and they make basically commitments towards becoming net zero. And in terms of implementing those commitments, they use carbon credits as one of the tools to achieve that. Okay, so in fact, what the latest deal in terms of commitments, it's about 3.5 billion tons of CO2 that the companies, global corporations have committed in order between now and 2030 in terms of reduction in their own emissions. which again is another element that's going to count towards that 20 billion that needs to be achieved. So obviously, once a carbon credit is delivered into a corporation, there is a payment that goes straight into the project developer or the project owner of that carbon project. Okay, and a little bit also on the project cycle. So what you saw previously was on the carbon project or the carbon credit is actually already in the market as a security, but it's actually not something not that easy to be done. There is a whole cycle from beginning all the way until issuance of the carbon credit that has to happen in order for the emission reduction to be produced. So it starts with designing the project. You know, what are you going to do? Are you going to implement a wind power plant? Are you going to, you know, liaise with local communities in forests that are endangered and, you know, agree with local governments and local communities in order to conserve that forest and in the future generate carbon credits? There is a number of things that need to be done to design a carbon project. Then you have to seek financing in order to start developing and making the project operational. So a third party needs to actually validate all your design, your financing, and everything you've done, and all the promise you've made in terms of producing those carbon credits. So that's the validation stage. That's usually done by an independent auditor. Then the project needs to be registered into a registry. And the registry, which I'm going to cover a little bit further down the presentation, is where those digital securities are actually created and controlled and traded. So there are a number of standards globally that hold those securities after registration and after issuance. So once you're registered, you are eligible to start generating carbon credits. But before you get carbon credits, you have to monitor. You have to let time pass, let's say a year or two, implement a monitoring procedure that was prescribed on your design of your project, and then demonstrate that you are able to reduce those emissions. And then once you're happy with the monitoring, you call again an auditor to do a verification that what you did is correct, that you are effectively generated emission reductions, and you can now get carbon credits as a result. And finally, after verification is done, comes issuance. And issuance is done by the same institution that holds the registry, that did the registration. So once issuance is done, the carbon credit effectively comes into existence. And what you see on the right side of the screen are basically different types of projects, different type of activities in which a carbon credit can be issued. And these are the more high-valued ones today, which involves reforestation, REDD+, which is conservation forests, coke stoves, which is changing the way, you know, the poorest in the world cook, which is by cutting down trees locally and obviously burning on wood-fired cook stoves. You replace that by cook stoves that are energy efficient and reduce emissions and create a number of benefits to those communities. And then on the top of that, as you saw in the previous slide as well, but I would like to emphasize here, there is an added aspect to how carbon projects are created and are managed today, which has to do with the Sustainable Development Goals. Today, those corporations that are making pledges towards reducing emissions, they're not only making pledges on the emissions themselves, on the climate mitigation, which should be Sustainable Development Goal number 13 on the left of the screen. But more often than not, these corporations are making pledges towards impact, toward more than one of the 17 UN SDGs, which is in the screen. For example, pledges towards no poverty, pledges towards quality education in poorer communities, gender equality, decent work, infrastructure, and a number of different things. Biodiversity, of course, number 15, life below water, which is number 14, and the list goes on. And what effectively happens in these carbon projects is exactly that. And I'm going to show one example now through another video.
Something amazing is happening in Kenya's 𝐃𝐢𝐬𝐜𝐻 corridor. Today, the spectacular 500,000-acre forest known as the 𝐃𝐢𝐬𝐜 corridor is home to thousands of elephants and growing population of lion, cheetah, giraffe, grevy's zebras, and even wild dogs. But just 20 years ago, the 𝐃𝐢𝐬𝐜 corridor was on a fast track to becoming a barren wasteland. It was being cleared for charcoal and slash-and-burn agriculture by a desperate community of 100,000 people who were suffering from extreme poverty, with little access to education or healthcare, and one of the highest rates of HIV in the world. What made the difference? Wildlife Works. Wildlife Works protects wildlife by making conservation work for local communities. For the past 20 years, Wildlife Works has pioneered conservation solutions in the 𝐃𝐢𝐬𝐜 corridor by working with local community and over 5,000 landowners. Wildlife Works created the first REDD+ forestry carbon project in the world. REDD+ projects create economic incentive to protect the forest and keep the trees standing by rewarding landowners and communities for stopping deforestation. The reward is in carbon credits, or VERs, verified emission reductions. Each VER represents 1 ton of emissions avoided. These VERs are sold to forward-thinking companies who want to reduce their carbon footprint. Protecting the 𝐃𝐢𝐬𝐜 corridor avoids emitting more than 1.5 million tons of carbon dioxide per year. And with millions of dollars in sales of VERs, the 𝐃𝐢𝐬𝐜 corridor REDD+ project has provided over 300 wildlife-friendly jobs, scholarship money awarded to over 3,000 students, 15 new schools, benefiting 8,500 children. Water projects now provide safe drinking water to 25,000 people. Over 50,000 trees have been planted to reforest degraded slopes. Over 500 women's groups selling handmade crafts. And eco-charcoal is being produced without cutting down a single tree. To learn more about the success of the 𝐃𝐢𝐬𝐜 corridor REDD+ project, go to wildlifeworks.com.
So as you could see through the video, this is really serious stuff that's going on today. This is no longer the realm of tree hugging. Okay, so in fact, what projects like this from Wildlife Works, and there are many of these projects out there today, is doing is turning capitalism, it's using the mechanism of capitalism to actually provide a template for sustainable development. That's basically what we saw there on the screen. And in fact, it's everything that we saw on this video and that actually happens on the ground on projects like this. It's directly related to how the economy, how economics works. For example, I saw recently an IMF report actually estimating that an elephant alive at current prices of carbon credits is worth $1.7 million just in carbon credits because of the amount of carbon emissions that an elephant alive, helps reducing, where the ivory for an elephant costs in the black market $9,000 to $15,000. So why would we kill an elephant when we face numbers like this? Of course, if local communities are desperate and they need any cash possible in order to survive, it's easy for people to turn into poachers, go there and kill an elephant. But when a project like this is developed and a substantial amount of the proceeds from the sale of carbon credits is deployed in that project, there is no more incentive for local communities to become poachers. And that's the whole idea of projects like this. Okay, so I'm just gonna move on now to the next topic, which is, let's now finally talk about AI and value discovery after the whole background that was given. And why do we need AI in order to provide value discovery in this market? And to give a clue to that, I'm gonna play another very short video.
In 2015, world leaders met in Paris and agreed on a most ambitious goal to tackle climate change to limit global warming by 1.5 degrees Celsius. To meet this goal,
we need to practically halve the amount of carbon dioxide released into the atmosphere by 2030 and drive emissions down to net zero by 2050. The world is working hard to implement the required radical changes to accomplish these goals, but it will take time. In the meantime, offsetting emissions today through the carbon markets offers an economically viable path to a net zero world. However, the voluntary carbon market suffers from a major obstacle: lack of clear valuation for carbon credits. The market for carbon credits is extremely complex, and value is hard to gauge because of the opacity of the over-the-counter transactions. Added to the challenge is the difficulty in appreciating the inherent value brought by the contributions of carbon projects to the 17 United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs. Viridios AI solves this problem by bringing valuation through artificial intelligence. Our models are trained on unique datasets of over-the-counter transactions, along with market and geoscience benchmarks. Our flagship solution, the Valuation and Risk Engine, VRE, computes fair value for even the most opaque carbon credits in the market, from the various certification standards, emission reduction activities, geographies, vintages, as well as SDG contributions. Value discovery is crucial in order to remove the obstacles for urgently needed capital flows into achieving the climate and sustainability goals. Viridios AI is here to meet the challenge. In 2015,
as the video stated, in any market, valuation, value discovery, price discovery is crucial. If you don't have that, if the market doesn't gain liquidity, doesn't emerge, and doesn't promote growth and capital flows into it. And the reason for what has been happening so far in the voluntary carbon markets, for example, is that the assets, as it was explained in the video, are highly complex. So there are a number of different attributes that can define a carbon credit, which makes it very hard to capture, at least to get a proper assessment of the nuances in value. And markets like this have evolved in other asset classes. So if you see, for example, when you're talking about the bond market is something similar to this. You have a number of different issuers, different regions, different sectors, different risk profiles for each issuer, and so on and so forth. However, the number of attributes that can define a bond are much simpler. You're really talking about, in the end of the day, the credit risk of the issuer, mostly, and the interest rate. But when it comes to carbon credits, you have many, many more attributes that actually end up defining value in those carbon credits. So that's why this carbon credit is so complex. On the top of that, most of the activity happens still through OTC markets. There is an emergence of exchanges as the market is progressing. But what we believe is going to happen is that the majority of the market will remain OTC precisely due to that nature of uniqueness of every single carbon credit. What has been emerging today through exchanges is the standardization of sections of this market. There are more visible, more liquid types of carbon credits that are becoming a little more standardized, and that you see on exchange and will continue to see on exchange, but you still have the vast majority of the market happening OTC and happening OTC because they are very unique. Again, to the analogy with the equity market, with the credit markets, for example, you do have like indices like iTraxx, CDX on credit risk, for example, which are highly traded, highly visible, liquid, but you still have a vast majority of that market trading on an OTC basis, on an over-the-counter basis. And then just one later element that adds to the complexity and to the difficulty of value these projects has been discussed so far is the contributions of the SDGs on those projects, which sometimes even get overlooked in monetary terms because it's so hard to actually assess the difference in value between one project that contributes, for example, to SDG 4 and a similar project that doesn't. So it becomes a very hard task to actually assess that value. And the only other solution would be actually knowing exactly how much money goes into each of those activities, which is very hard to fetch or to transpire from those activities. So just a little bit more on the complexity of those assets. As I mentioned, there are a number of factors, and these are the main factors the technology we developed take into account today. For example, the standard I mentioned, the registry where the carbon credits go, these are called standards. And there are quite a few standards in the market. I'm showing 6 of the biggest ones here on the screen. Then we have the geography or the country where the project has been implemented. Then you have the activity itself. What type of project is that? Is that a reforestation? Is that a conservation of forest? Is that an energy efficiency project? And if it's energy efficient, is it domestic or industrial? Is it renewable energy or power generation and so on? Then you have vintage. So, and vintage, it's similar to a vintage of a car. It's the year in which the car, for example, was produced. That's the year in which the carbon credit was generated. So older vintage has fetched less value in the markets compared to newer vintages, as it happens to most products in the economy, except for wine and products like that, which is the other way around. Then you have SDGs. Finally, the contribution to each or any one of those 17 UN SDGs. And how do we assess difference in value given different contributions? On the top of that, as mentioned in the video and previously, we have the opacity that most of the market trades and transacts over the counter. And it's really not transparent to what level each price of each project is at any moment in time. And again, when you add SDG contributions to it, it becomes a bit more complex. Okay, so the solution that we came up with was basically to implement an AI technology, a piece of AI technology that managed to capture all of those components in a single engine. And the idea of why to use AI is because the problem is so complex, and AI is a very effective solution to complex problems. It has been proven in many different sectors, and this is nothing new. What we're doing, other sectors are using AI for precisely problems similar to this, with very high complexity. It's just that we were able to collate a number of data sets over time with market transactions. And when we put those things together into an AI engine, you end up getting those nuances in value. So a good overview for that is this slide. So in our AI engine, it's basically a neural network, as it is out there with many other AI engines, but we combine transaction data, project data, benchmarks, and the benchmarks are the liquid reference values that are observable every day that relate to the values of those transaction prices over time. So when you do that relation, when you train models through that relationship, the model learns what is the pattern of value for any type of standard project activity, content of contribution of SDGs, vintage, in relation to the values of the benchmarks at any point in time. And an example of a benchmark we use here is the CO2 concentration in the atmosphere. Obviously, if CO2 concentration increases, carbon price is supposed to increase, because now we are supposed to have more carbon credits in order to mitigate the climate issue. And another example is the price of carbon in Europe. That's another type, which are the EUAs, another type of benchmark that provides carbon price signal into the engine. And then we combine as well some qualitative criteria or qualitative data into the engine. And one example of that is the CORSIA standard that came out in 2020, which is basically the standard for carbon offsets to be delivered into the exchange, into the trading scheme of the airlines, which is called CORSIA. And with that, we came up with what we're calling valuation risk engine, which is today in production. It's actually open for subscription, and we have already a number of subscribers to that technology, mostly players, active players in the market, and corporations offsetting carbon emissions as well, coming to the platform in order to realize the values in which they're supposed to not only budget, but negotiate in terms of purchase of carbon credits. And just one added information is that on the back of this AI engine, we were able to recently went into a partnership with S&P Global Platts, and we are currently publishing indices, global carbon indices, which we call CARBEX, which are based on this AI model, and we have 6 of them based on 6 types of different project activities like reforestation and conservation of forests and so on, with different content of contributions to SDGs. So anyone can go actually to the S&P Global Platts website. The link is at the bottom of the page, and sign up for free and start looking at those indices as well. And finally, one last thing I wanted to cover on the AI topic is that now the neural networks is becoming more and more complex and more accurate as we go through time, as we feed more data sets. What we see on the screen here is a knowledge graph, and we are building now knowledge graphs to actually more accurately assess the contribution of projects to co-benefits, to sustainable development goals. So those contributions can be hard to come by if we don't have specific certifications by an auditor and so on. Through technology and through probably I would say this is the most cutting edge type of technology in AI being practiced today, which is the building of knowledge graphs and building AI models on top of that. So through this technology, we're able actually to assess the type of development, sustainable development goals that the project is contributing. And that, as you also saw previously, that's extremely important for us to gauge value of projects. We need to know as well what are the level of contributions to those goals. And if you want a bit more detail on what, how AI works in terms of producing value discovery in the carbon markets, just go to our site, Viridios AI. You can request a demo there, and we're happy to go into a bit more details on how this whole thing works. And with that, with 15 minutes to go, I can open now for a Q&A, and I can open the floor now. Anyone who wishes to ask a question or make a comment, feel free. Okay, any questions so far? Okay, so if no questions, I'd like to thank everybody for being here, for attending this presentation. Now I'm going to stop recording the screen.